It could be argued that Clive Staples Lewis, known by his friends as Jack, was born in 1898 to an established middle-class Irish family on some idyllic farm paddock. And that's true. However, one could equally make an argument that C.S. Lewis was born one boyhood day when his brother Warnie burst into the room to show Jack a toy garden that he had made in a box. In the center of the toy garden was a single, magnificent blue flower. An image that would stick with him for the rest of his life. Indeed, the blue flower seemed to epitomize Lewis and the relationship he will come to have with the world around him. The blue flower, of course, being a medieval German Romantic era symbol of being in love with something from afar. A yearning for that which you cannot hold but have obtained. The symbol of the Romantics. And C.S. Lewis calls this feeling joy. In his life of joy, yearning for all that he cannot hold begins. Lewis lived a somewhat blissful boyhood life at his home Little Leah. He grew up in Belfast with his brother Warnie Lewis, father Albert Lewis, and mother Florence Lewis. They came from a long line of Irish clergy and theology, bringing in a substantial living over the generations. But when Warnie, Clive's brother, left for school and Lewis was left home with his governess Mrs. Harper, C.S. Lewis decided then and there to reject his parents' Christian roots. Her strict moralizing brought him to hate the religion of his ancestors. Then, the year of 1908 struck the Lewis household. Albert Lewis, C.S. Lewis's father, lost his dear brother and his own father, suddenly just months apart. And then, just a few months after that, C.S. Lewis's own mother, Albert's wife, died just as suddenly of cancer. In his diary, a young Jack Lewis wrote, "Crying both with headache and toothache, and distressed because my mother did not come to me. That was because she was ill too." And then my father, in tears, came into my room and began to try to convey to my terrified mind things it had never conceived before. Surrounded by death, Albert Lewis had a hard time grieving, and he isolated himself from both of his sons, Warnie and Jack. And so he sent them away to a boarding school in Wynyard. And Jack never really forgave his father for leaving him to fend for himself. Abhorring the boarding school he was sent to, both Lewis and Warnie begged their father to move them. After months of not hearing anything from their now estranged father, Warnie was just suddenly called to another school. Several months after that, Jack was finally called back home. And it was there, back home, where his father Albert explained that, well, he had made plans for Lewis to leave Wynyard and instead study under the close tutelage of his good friend William T. Kirkpatrick. You see, it was while studying with Kirkpatrick, actually while waiting for the train to meet Kirkpatrick, that Lewis picks up a book that will change his life forever. George MacDonald's Phantastes. Indeed, Lewis will later recount that this was the moment when his imagination was baptized into holiness. Phantastes is an imagined dream or vision in which the hero, Aludos, which means in Greek, no way, wakes up to find that his bedroom is not as he remembered it. This story made particular appeal to Lewis, the young man with no way in the world, pursuing images of selfhood, images of womanhood, images of loss, images of death. Of course, Lewis was not baptized into a literal holiness, for if Lewis rejected Christianity before studying under Kirkpatrick, he certainly was groomed to reject the faith intellectually, as Kirkpatrick had already done. In the summer of 1917, Lewis then got a letter announcing his official enrollment at the School of Oxford. But by this time, Lewis was old enough to join the war, and so he did just that. And while in basic training, Jack met a character who will change his life again. His first bunkmate, Paddy Moore. Paddy died in battle some months later, distraught and overcome with grief and trauma from World War I, Lewis made it his mission in life, his highest calling, to look after Patty's mother, Jannie Moore. And this is how his relationship with Mrs. Moore began. And it has bewildered scholars for nearly a century now. After all, C.S. Lewis, a 20-year-old boy at the time, found himself domestically engaged with a middle-aged woman and her young adult daughter, Maureen Moore. And his letters to his best friend Arthur Greeves at the time suggest that Lewis had no concept of sexual morals or ethics. But it also managed to bewilder his family and friends back home at the time. His father, along with Arthur Greeves and Warnie, his brother, often convened to discuss the precarious and odd nature of Jack's relationship to the Moores. Indeed, this domestic partnership influenced most of Lewis's writings all the way up until her death in 1951. In fact, it almost makes his book The Four Loves make sense. Lewis found himself in a sort of non-legally binding adoptive relationship with Mrs. Moore, and he had no categories for it. But it was love, as he admits. It was parental love. Storge love, as Lewis will later make famous. Regardless, his relationship with Mrs. Moore strained his relationship with his own father to a breaking point. In fact, Lewis dropped contact with his family during the 4 years of his undergraduate studies at Oxford. During his undergraduate years, Lewis became something of a contradiction to himself, philosophically speaking. It was at University College, Oxford, that Jack became convinced that the Christian God simply did not exist. But he detested the moral relativism of his day, and he was adamant in asserting that there is an objective and an absolute reality, but it does not need to be the God of the Bible, he was convinced. And so he concluded that it was something like literature or truth generally that was absolute reality. It was something of an absurd conclusion, sure, but it satisfied Lewis at the time. This was the very thing that Lewis wrote about in his first published work, Spirits in Bondage. It was an anthology of essays and poems about the source of meaning in one's life. And during this time, while Lewis rarely spoke to his father, relations with Warnie began to come back around. You see, Jack got a job teaching English at Magdalen College and was a philosophy tutor at University College, both of which in Oxford. Lewis was growing up. You see, C.S. Lewis grew from an ordinary boy trying to fit in into an ordinary man with all of his faults and shabby clothes. However, he did always retain one extraordinary aspect. He was prodigious among his fellow students. And in 1926, he published his first epic poem, Dimer, another tale about an angsty protagonist eager to find truth and meaning in a meaningless world. At University College, Lewis made friends with several key writers of the 20th century, almost all of whom had a deeper faith in a God that Lewis did not believe in than Lewis had in his own agnosticism. These friendships included Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson, Neville Coghill, Charles Williams, and a large, eccentric, fast-talking Englishman named John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. In fact, Tolkien and Lewis became fast friends, though they were vastly different. And it was here where Lewis learned of academics who may have known more about northernness than himself, and yet still maintained a healthy faith life. After all, Tolkien, a devout Catholic, began to teach Lewis how to speak Ancient Norse, a title that not many can put on their resumes, or would even want to. It was very much Kirkpatrick's method of learning a language, but Lewis was soon to find out that Tolkien had more to offer him than the chance to learn Old Norse. Lewis and Tolkien developed a deep friendship over the course of the 1920s. Mostly, they just talked. They talked about anything and everything, from language to literature to faith and falsehoods. And so it's really no surprise that Lewis found himself, one fateful night in 1929, after being morally and philosophically battered and beaten down, that in the quiet of his own bedroom, C.S. Lewis, the most reluctant convert in all of Christianity, as he says, knelt down and prayed for the first time to a God he did not yet fully believe in. And so, over the next 2 years, talk of language and literature was almost entirely consumed by questions of faith and meaning. Lewis spoke most candidly with J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, their mutual friend. But he began to let his questions be answered by his childhood best friend Arthur Greeves and his brother Warnie Lewis, both men who had converted to Christianity sometime shortly after World War I. The walls were coming down. And so it would be 4 a.m. on a September evening in 1931 that the world would change for all of Christianity as it changed for Clive Staples Lewis. Tolkien and Lewis were walking around Oxford, arguing, debating, struggling to grasp the meaning of life and faith, when Tolkien said this: "We speak of stars and trees as though they were entities which we have mastered in our post-Newtonian materialist fashion. But for those who formed the words star and tree, they were very different. All creation was myth-woven and elf-patterned." Or, in other words, Tolkien was inviting Lewis to see the world as a true myth, as a sovereignly devised, divinely appointed story unfolding in the cosmos. He was inviting him to see truth and beauty around every corner. And so, just a few days later, C.S. Lewis with his brother Warnie went out with the Moors. And as Lewis recounts, he and his brother left in a motorcycle that morning. He had left an atheist. But by the time they reached the restaurant, Lewis had become a Christian. Like all Christians who have a moment of conversion, life begins to look quite different after than it did before. And if nothing of Lewis can be said of his moral and personal life, which changed drastically after his conversion, his literary life changed completely. For up until now, you see, Lewis had only published 2 quite mediocre pieces of writing. And after his conversion in 1931 and up until his death, Clive Staples Lewis seemed to never stop writing. He and his Oxford friends met weekly, sometimes daily, thinking, discussing, debating, but most of all talking about life, literature, and the pursuit of God. This cohort of Christian men called their discursive group of inquisitive minds the Inklings. The Inklings were, to a man, and they were all men, comrades who had been touched by war, who viewed life through the lens of war, yet who looked for hope and found it in fellowship, where so many other modern writers and intellectuals saw only broken narratives. The Inklings have been written much about, and they are somewhat of a beautiful picture of what it means to be a Christian. You see, God made all of these broken men to believe in God and then rooted them each in a community where they could grow and belong together. This caused some of the greatest Christian literature of the 20th century to be written. In fact, if there was a Christian writer alive at this time, they likely stopped in for a pint with the Inklings at the Eagle and Child. So Lewis began his literary journey with The Pilgrim's Regress, something of a callback to his earliest poetic publications. This epic poem was about a man searching for meaning in the world's philosophies. But he regressed back to the point where he realizes that only something like Christianity could be the one true religion. And while The Pilgrim's Regress wouldn't do nearly as well as some of Lewis's books written later in the decade, it sold better than all of his previous works combined. And while Lewis would never come to love his Christian apologetic writings, he did begin to look at them as his evangelistic duty. And so after word got out of his hard-hitting academic apologetic work, he began to become commissioned by various publishing houses to write for them. And thus, the first 2 apologetic works of Lewis were written: The Problem of Pain and The Screwtape Letters. Quickly, after those two were published, Lewis began to receive lots of fan mail. Rooted in his belief that no one were ordinary, everyone were immortal, and he had a duty to bring all things in subjection to Christ, Lewis began to respond to each letter by hand, though this he claimed to have enjoyed quite a bit. In 1938, Lewis began writing his fantasy space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet. At the same time, Tolkien began works on a curious sequel to his most recent publication about a hobbit who tries to steal gold from a dragon. Both works were written in the academic safety of the Inklings. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, and after the booming success of Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis was asked to speak quite frequently on British public radio. He addressed matters of faith and purpose publicly to a vast audience, instilling a deep sense of hope in his nation. All of this, however, only sought to strain Lewis's professional and personal life. This entire time, he was still tied up in domestic duties with the Moore family, mind you. At his home in Oxford dawned the kilns, something that continued to perplex his closest friends. His friends who, at Oxford, viewed him as something of a sellout or a fake. And at Oxford, a school who continued to deny him full professorship. The Lewis of the 1940s was still very much the philosophy and medieval history professor that he would come to identify as, and not nearly as well known as the theologian. His works vacillated between great treatises on faith in the human condition and quite stiff academic works of literature. You see, in just 1 year, Lewis wrote the 16th century English literature excluding drama textbook and The Great Divorce. But really, all of this seemed to be preparing his imagination for what most consider his greatest work, a chronicle of children's books that culminated in both the loss of his great friendship and the death of his beloved Mrs. Moore. That, of course, is the Chronicles of Narnia, which Lewis published in 1950. By that time, Lewis and Tolkien had a complicated relationship. You see, Tolkien thought Lewis's boisterous public speaking was inappropriate for someone like Lewis. Plus, Tolkien had been working on a fantasy novel for some 15 years that Lewis critiqued heavily and constantly, the critiques seeming to get more personal as time went on. Meanwhile, Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia seemingly overnight and included characters like Santa Claus and Jesus Christ as a lion in the plot. Something that made Tolkien frustrated, to say the least. They had no big dramatic argument or falling out that caused them to stop speaking, but gradually, after the end of World War II, the Inklings, along with Lewis and Tolkien, began to stop speaking to each other. And then in 1951, Mrs. Moore died. And Lewis found himself basically entirely alone at the kilns. The last great chapter of Lewis's life was when he was surprised by Helen Joy Davidman Gresham, or Joy Davidman, in 1952. You see, a fan letter came across his desk from the newly divorced Joy Davidman, an American writer who was deeply influenced by the Screwtape Letters. She had 2 boys and had recently moved to London. And Lewis, ever the evangelist, jumped at the opportunity to meet. Jack recounts the feeling of euphoria, saying that he honestly felt bad that he was experiencing a love that most men have in their 20s, near the end of his life. And he wrote Surprised by Joy in 1955, a spiritual biography that actually did not feature Joy Davidman. Joy and Clive Lewis married in 1956. During this time, Lewis finally got full professorship at Cambridge University. In fact, he worked at Cambridge during the week and he would commute back to the kilns on the weekends. His inaugural address to Cambridge, a great work of literature in and of itself, epitomized really everything Lewis believed. Indeed, it was his letter of joy. Joy Davidman, like Lewis's mother, developed serious cancer 4 years after marrying Lewis. and died in 1960. She was such a profound influence on Lewis's writing during just those 4 years that he told a close friend that she practically co-authored Till We Have Faces, and she always wanted him to write a reflection on the Psalms. After her death, Lewis published one more apologetic essay titled A Grief Observed. C.S. Lewis then died in 1963. His mark on Christian writing and academia can be felt for centuries. This is all, of course, in spite of the fact that C.S. Lewis was never a theologian. Okay, of course, strictly speaking, I mean, he was a theologian, but he really never considered himself one, or wanted to be considered one. C.S. Lewis may not be considered a theologian because he almost never wrote on or discussed doctrines, which is what theologians really do in the strict sense of the word. No, Lewis was first and foremost a philosopher, even a poet. This is an important distinction to make, however, because it means that, unlike the other videos that we've made, we actually can't talk about Lewis's personal theology. I mean, you tell me. Was he an annihilationist? A post-millennial ecclesial soteriologist? You see, we just don't know any of that because Lewis didn't really concern himself with it. No, C.S. Lewis was concerned first and foremost with sparking our imagination to see the world properly. Really, to romanticize real life. And this is very much so the content of his inaugural address at Cambridge. You see, Lewis was offered the chair of medieval studies at Cambridge University, and in his inaugural address, he talks about many of the things that concerned him most, and they seem to symbolize all that he wrote about. That we have made these arbitrary distinctions in history, that we think we're better than ancient peoples just because we have the latest technology, which has all culminated in us losing sight of the divine in everything. In many ways, Lewis was prophetic in that regard. You see, he had his finger on the pulse of his society. He lived in a world that was politically contentious, ethnically divided, hyper-focused on materialism. It's not like we could ever imagine a world like that today. You see, C.S. Lewis was deeply troubled by the world he saw and the way in which he saw that it was heading. So C.S. Lewis, rather famously, devoted his life to, as he claims, re-paganizing culture. Of course, because he knows a lot more than we do, he meant something very specific by this. You see, Lewis knew that the pagan cultures of the ancient world were closer to understanding God than we are, because, well, they saw gods in everything. The pagan cultures of the epic poems that Lewis taught looked to the sky, and they didn't just see the sun, they saw generosity, life, kindness, warmth, light, and so they worshipped. But when we look to the sky, we only see this sort of materialist, empirical reality, one that needs to be observed and analyzed by hard facts. Lewis saw how that really affected our culture in ways that we couldn't imagine and was actually driving us to atheism. So if we could only reintroduce this sort of innocent magic into the world, it would be easier for us to talk about the one true God of the Bible, and it would get us closer to how the Bible was actually written. This made Lewis somewhat controversial, but he was also extremely frustrated because we look at these ancient pagan traditions and we call them stupid, we call them primitive, and yet we can't seem to hold something as both true and fictional at the same time, which they did quite easily. Real and mythology. And this is what Lewis was trying to combine. Now, this may all sound like nonsense to some, but to others, this is very real. I mean, just look at how Christians debate Genesis 1. Lewis may have been in awe of the fact that we refuse to see it as both symbolically significant and true at the same time. And so we come to something like bread and wine. And instead of seeing wine molecules or substance for our bodies, the Bible really does ask us to see more, to see body and blood, to see life and forgiveness. By losing our ability to create meaningful symbols from everyday realities, we lose the heart of Christianity, Lewis feared. So his whole life, all of his writings were really dedicated to reigniting our imagination by transforming the everyday, ordinary things of life, a wardrobe, into extraordinary icons of God's truth. He called this myth, and he claimed that Jesus was really the embodiment of this reality. He called him myth become fact. And so, something as ordinary as a wardrobe could transport you into a completely new world, just like how something as ordinary as bread and wine could introduce you to something reality-altering. So, all of his apologetic works are really built off of this foundation. He was simply a man trying to re-paganize his culture in the hopes that they would find God along the way. Trying to reintroduce our imaginations into a wonderful and expansive world of gods and sovereignty, in the hope that we all become a little bit closer to seeing the one true God and the salvation he offers in Jesus Christ every single day. Until next time, this was Theology Unbound. Hey, Austin here. Just a quick reminder about Bible Unbound and the content you just watched, which was supported by our funders over on patreon.com. Patreon is where you try to get a bunch of people to donate small amounts to fund a mission. And the mission of Bible Unbound is to discover the Bible by uncovering the gospel. You see, we are passionate about creating a community of people who want to see Bible-curious people understand the Bible by seeing the gospel and Jesus proclaimed throughout the entire thing. And so if you want to fund that mission, if you want to become a part of the vision we have over here at Bible Unbound, you can explore more of that over on patreon.com. We'd love to see you there. Thanks so much.